Howdy folks. So I have a new little device here that I'm going to use for voice recordings as I walk around the shop. So I'm going to turn that on now. So hopefully my voice will sound a little bit better now because the GoPro camera changes position and the microphone changes, and it seems like the recorder on this device here is a little bit better for picking up voice recordings. And I kind of rigged it onto this mount. This is a chest strap that works with the GoPro cameras, and I made a custom mount with 4 cork bumpers, and I screwed a rubber bumper through the battery case, so that's fixed on there, and then I wrapped zip ties around that to secure that on. And it's pretty stiff. It's not too tight, but I can operate all of the buttons on this recorder. So I did that this morning, so I'm just kind of testing that out and seeing how this works using the voice recorder in conjunction with the GoPro. So I'm going to do a quick video about my table saws, and this will also serve as a tool review for the Grizzly table saw, which I've used for the past several years. It's a 12-inch table saw, and I usually have the 10-inch blade on it. I have a couple large 12-inch rip blades that I use for cutting 4-inch thick material for table legs when I need to, but most of the time a 10-inch blade works fine. So right now I have both my saws set up for making some custom parts, small parts. I can do a quick demo. But these are some custom sleds that I made. I'm making 2 different size cross cuts, and this cross cut sled works with the blade at a 30-degree angle. And over here I have a router table set up. This is my main router table that I use. It's got a 3 horsepower Porter cable motor on it with variable speed. So I can put large bits in this if I need to. And I have the dust collection hooked up to the fence here to this hose. And this is a very simple router table. It's made out of corian. I bought 3 cut-off sheets of corian, which is this material. If you know where a solid surface countertop facility is, you can sometimes get cut-off pieces for a very inexpensive price. I'm going to just run a quick demo. I usually have the dado blade mounted on my smaller saw, as I do a lot of dado joinery. But when I'm doing custom cross cutting, I'll put a smaller blade. This is an 8-inch blade here. Overall, I'm fairly happy with the Grizzly table saw. My biggest criticism is the excessive runout on the Arbor. which I didn't notice for a couple years after using it, but it is substantial for the price of the machine. I would expect a little bit smoother operation, but it doesn't seem to affect the quality of the cuts, at least for what I'm using it for. But it is a very powerful machine. It has a 5 horsepower motor, so cutting 2-inch thick oak or 4-inch thick pine is no trouble for it at all. On my smaller table saw, I have a 1.5 horsepower motor, and in that case, sometimes a 2x4 is enough to bog it down and trip the circuit breaker. So it's a big difference to go from a 1.5 horsepower to a 5 horsepower machine. So in terms of production cutting, it's a great workhorse machine. The other big drawback about it is the dust collection system, where the way it was configured, the way it came with the machine was had a design flaw. Well, 2 design flaws. And I'm going to open up the machine and explain what I did to solve that problem and make it work almost perfectly. Another problem I had with it was with the switch. The switch tends to get clogged up with dust, and sometimes I have to squirt it out, and then it works okay. But it's a fairly maintenance-free machine. The biggest maintenance I have to do with it is it does require a lot of greasing. The internal parts, worm gears and shafts, need to be greased at least once a year. Otherwise they get real stiff and difficult to adjust. And on my other smaller saw, I never had that problem where it just, kind of froze up. But this Grizzly machine will actually freeze up after a while. And I think it has more to do with the material I'm cutting, because I cut mostly pine. It's very resiny and builds up a sticky residue all over those worm gears inside. And some folks have been asking me about my over-the-blade table saw dust port that I had hanging on my ceiling here. And I put that thing together, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago, and it's really made a big difference in the wood shop here. So I have this hose kind of dangling here. I had it strapped up to the ceiling better, but I've been using this 4-inch hose for hooking up different machines temporarily, so I can have that hung up a little bit better. But so far it hasn't really gotten in the way of things. So I have this boat hook here, which I can use to raise and lower this thing. And usually I'll hook it up right here. That's the second level, so I don't have to pull it quite as far. So I have it hinged in this location, and I already had this ductwork hung up already, and it just happened to be that that's where my hinge location needed to be, so I had to build kind of a bulkhead around that pipe in order to attach that hinge. And this comes down at about a 45-degree angle. And so it just hangs by its own weight here. And this chain holds most of the weight. And I can adjust the height a little bit by turning this turnbuckle. Sometimes I need to increase the height for cutting thicker material to clear this. And then this moves back and forth. So I get some adjustment there because when I change the blade angle, the position of this hood has to change with the angle. And I have just some slotted bolts here to secure this in. So the most difficult part of this was making this sleeve and then cutting the channels inside of the PVC. That was a little bit tricky. So I have a couple positions marked for doing standard size. This is the head that I built for it. It's got a little bit of duct tape on it to optimize the airflow. But it just fits on here like this. So these things under here, I was experimenting with an anti-kickback feature. So that if I have a thick piece that tries to pass underneath here, it'll be stopped by this. But so that's that. What I like about this design is that I have clearance on this side of the blade, so the fence is usually on this side, so that I can have clear access to pass the workpiece through here. Usually the designs have a boom arm that hangs on the right side of the table saw, and I don't like those designs because that arm can frequently get in the way when I have to make different kinds of cuts. So this is better to operate the machine. You know, I can make most of my cuts with the dust hood in that position. And if I need to move this out of the way, I just pull this string, and that gives me clearance. Usually this is like 2 feet of clearance here, and that's plenty if I need to make some cuts without the dust hood. So, but the dust collection here is nothing fancy. I just have a standard 4-inch port that hooks up to the bottom. And so there's no over-the-blade dust collection on this saw. And so I do get some buildup in there. I enclosed the back of the machine. There's actually an enclosure that's built under here because the motor hangs out in back of the machine. So I built an enclosure around the motor of my smaller saw, and I did this when this was my primary saw that I used in a vain effort to try to contain the sawdust a little bit better. And that worked for coarser particles, which is what you see built up in here. It's not too bad. These are mostly particles from dado cuts, but it doesn't really help the fine dust problem. But in this case it helps because I have storage underneath here, so it helps keeps dust out of the storage area under the shelf. So on my main table saw, I've got this 4-inch port collecting dust above the blade, and that hole on the bottom of that plastic tray there is hooked up to this 2.5-inch hose, and that collects the dust on the bottom of the table saw blade. And so those are the 2 ports that I use for dust collection. There's a 3rd port that's on the bottom that I normally keep closed, and that's the main port that actually is intended to run the table saw. And you can see there is some dust that settles inside the cabinet here. I found that the dust collection works actually more efficiently with this closed, because that brings more suction to this smaller hose and the hose on top of the blade. So if I maximize efficiency of the dust collection at the point of source, which is these two holes right here, that smaller one and this bigger 4-inch one, if I maximize airflow at those two locations, I actually maximize my overall efficiency. And this 4-inch port on the bottom is redundant. But I do use it when I need to clean out the extra that builds up in the bottom, and when I have to clean the dust out inside here, which I'm going to do. And I'm going to lubricate my worm gears so that my hand wheel raise and lower and blade angle change works better, because right now they're a little bit stiff. So right now I have all three ports on. I have that 4-inch port on the bottom, 4-inch port here, and then a 2.5-inch port there. Alright, so I got my dust cleaned out of the interior of my table saw as best as I could. So I'm going to open this up down here. Okay. So you can see where that 2.5-inch hose hooks up underneath the blade there. Now when I bought this table saw, this 4-inch dust port here on the bottom was the only dust hookup that came with the machine. And what they did was to attach this 2.5-inch hose. Hello. They co-joined it here where this 4-inch hookup is, and so there's a 2.5-inch port and a 4-inch port combined into one 4-inch port. So that sort of worked. It's not a very efficient way to branch off your airflow. But what would happen was that when I did a lot of production, particularly the canvas stretcher frames, cutting up 20 plus sheets of plywood at a time, what would happen is dust would build up inside this compartment, and it would kind of avalanche down and then cover up this port. And so a lot of dust would build up and then just bury that 4-inch port. So the 2.5-inch hose was the only dust collection that was working, and the dust that would build up inside the interior of this cabinet was not removed efficiently. So it would build up over time, and it did not clear itself out. So I would have to constantly open this up and suck out the sawdust that would build up inside, because it just wasn't working right there. So that was design flaw number 1 on behalf of Grizzly, because really what they should have done is had 2 dust ports. They should have had a dedicated 4-inch port here and then a 2.5-inch port hooked up somewhere else. On some of their bandsaws, they have 2 4-inch ports. I don't know why they don't do it for their table saws. So what I did is I cut a hole right there to fit that 2.5-inch hose. So instead of hooking it up here, I just redirected it back out that side there. And that actually worked a little bit better, but it didn't solve the dust problem here. So the dust would not build up in the cabinet here, but this hose would get clogged up very easily, because I'm sure if you've used a table saw, you've had this happen to you many times, but even with a zero clearance insert, little slivers of wood will get sucked in and it will build up on the bottom of this and get sucked into that 2.5-inch port. So if I cut a little sliver of wood off on when I'm ripping wood, it can sometimes get sucked in there, and then it gets clogged in that 2.5-inch hose, because the way they had it hooked up before, that 2.5-inch hose made a sharp 90-degree bend, and that bend was too tight to allow slivers of wood to pass through. So even if it was like a 3-inch sliver of wood, it would get stuck in that bend, and I would constantly get clogs. So it required a lot of maintenance. So and it was difficult to take apart because it's difficult to reach these components inside. I'm already hunched over pretty well. It's difficult for me to reach it there. So finally I got fed up with that, and what I ended up doing is I covered up this hole and I cut a larger hole, a much larger hole in back here, and that follows the path of the blade change when I change the angle of the saw. So in this way, I eliminated that sharp 90-degree bend. And so this section of hose is straight here, and I built this box that basically supports the hose, and it helps close up that large opening that I had to cut. I'll change the angle of the blade so you can see. I'll see if I can attach this on somewhere. There we go. So I have to take this box off every once in a while and clean out inside here. I'll get a little bit of dust built up in there, and it just kind of hangs on this sleeve. So that solved my problem. I haven't had a clog in here since. So it's a pretty straight shot all the way down. And this connection here is a much more efficient way to branch off your airflow. So instead of having it cojoined at that location where all the dust piles in, it's split off right here. And so that works much more efficiently. But just a note, if you drill a hole in the cabinet of your table saw, it will void the warranty of your machine. So, but my rationale was, what point is the warranty if the dust collection isn't working properly? So this worked out pretty well. I'm gonna get inside there and lubricate some of those worm gears. The Grizzly machine has a cover plate right here, and this is annoying because I have to take this off with some screws that are way down there, and that's the only way I can get to these gears that are buried in there. This is my gear grease. Okay, so I've got my trunnions and my worm gears all lubed up. So my crank wheels are working smoothly now to make the adjustments of the saw, whereas before it was very difficult. And so I'm going to just do my routine cleaning and sealing of the cast iron tool surfaces. And I've been using this product for many years, and it works pretty good. It's expensive stuff, but I like the way it smells. So to start this, I'm going to clean the surface. I'm going to use denatured alcohol. So when I work with pine, there's often a residue that's left on the surface, and this can build up and leave a sticky layer. So it's good to remove this any grease or residue before you do the sealing. Sometimes I'll even use a little scoring pad to help work it in there a little bit better. Because sometimes that stuff can be caked on there, especially around the throat plate. It tends to build up there when the sawdust is hot. Alright, so that's good and clean. I'll just let that dry a little bit. Well, that is what I do to maintain my table saw on a yearly basis. I do the seal coat, the top coat, probably every 3 or 4 months, depending on what I'm doing with it. I usually lubricate it and seal it before I have to do some kind of operation on it that requires a very slick surface, but I have a secret compartment. I'll show it to you. So I just keep miscellaneous table saw stuff in here. And I wanted to show this to you because this is the sight gauge that came with the table saw fence, and this thing was terrible. So this is the sight gauge that I made out of copper, and I just formed it by hand. This is the one that came with the Grizzly. So this sight gauge is much easier to look at. It's much more crisp definitions with this copper edge, and there's not much difference. There's no deviation from side to side. So I had a much easier time looking at this and making readings. As soon as I saw this thing, I just thought it was a joke. Because what happens is this plastic gets covered with dust in about 2 minutes. You know, the static charge of this plastic attracts dust, and so it becomes almost invisible just after using the tool after a couple minutes, and this one remains clean. So it's a simple fix, but overall the table saw fence on this machine is great. It's one of the better features of the Grizzlies. I've used the Bismarck fences, and this is just as good. It's very responsive, very sturdy, and I think that wraps up my tool review for that. Oh, this digital gauge is a joke. It doesn't work. It's been completely useless. I wish I could find a way to easily disconnect it, because it just eats up power because it's on all the time. But it has no accuracy at all. So I just use the graduated gauge that came with the machine, even though it's a little bit difficult to see because the hand wheels are so big. It's, you have to look under the hand wheel to see the reading. It would be nice to have the gauge here where it'd be more visible, but it's Grizzly. They should be paying me for this video. Well, that's all I got today, folks. If you have any more questions about how my table saw setup works, feel free to drop me a message. I'm going to stop this video.